Hello, everyone. Hello. It's definitely a little strange because I can't see everyone, but I know that you're there. Welcome to tonight's town hall on family policing in New York City. We're getting ready to start. Before we do so, I want folks to know that we will be offering Spanish language interpretation of this webinar. After this introduction, we will turn on the interpretation feature. At that point, if you would like to listen to this webinar in Spanish, you will be able to select the interpretation button at the bottom of your screen and select Spanish. I'm going to pass it off to Ana to share these instructions in Spanish, and then we will turn on the interpretation channels and get started. So go ahead, Ana.
Saludo a todos y qué placer que ustedes están aquí en el día de hoy para este seminario web que se llama el Sistema de Vigilancia Familiar en la Ciudad de Nueva York. Para ustedes accesar la interpretación en español, que nosotros lo vamos a ofrecer en español, después de esta introducción, esto va a ser encendido en la parte de abajo de su sistema de Zoom. En la parte de abajo, ustedes lo van a poder accesar con el icono del globo. Ahí en el icono del globo, ustedes pueden elegir el idioma español para ustedes escuchar este seminario en español. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Ana. All right, everyone, let's get started. I think we have, okay, here we go. So we have some important notes. Before I do that, I'll just introduce myself very quickly. My name is Zoe Russell. I am an attorney at the Bronx Defenders in the Family Defense Practice, where I represent parents in Bronx Family Court. I also do policy work where I work to advocate on behalf of parents in the legislative world as well as in communities. I'm really happy that everyone is here today. I want everyone to know that you can put questions and answers in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We're going to be answering questions at the end of the webinar. I also want to make sure that people know that this is a public webinar. So if you have personal stories or you have an open case, we suggest that you don't share those specific details about your experience in order to protect your own privacy. Lastly, we can't provide legal advice during this session. However, we will share contact information for free legal service providers. And lastly, I want people to know that this is being recorded. So again, you want to be mindful what you might be sharing where other folks can see it. And now we're going to have a short word from our sponsors. We want to thank Council Member Abreu for holding this space for us today. And I want to briefly pass it to him to say a few words.
Good evening, everybody. It is such an honor to be here for this discussion on a critical issue that is deeply personal and that has shaped my path of my career in law and politics, the issue of family rights. Before we get into it, I want to extend my sincere thanks to Jennifer Feinberg, the Center for Family Representation, and all the organizers for putting this important and timely event together. We are in for a good conversation tonight, where we will hear from an impressive slate of speakers, specialists in law, social work, and community outreach, who are committed to supporting stable families, pushing back against injustice, and building safer communities. It is conversations like this one where change is put into motion. For those who don't know me, I grew up in Washington Heights in a tight-knit Dominican family. When my family was evicted from our home when I was a kid, we had no one to tell us that what our rights were and or who could fight for us on our behalf. It was a scary feeling, and unfortunately, it is a feeling that too many families are experiencing right now, with evictions, displacement, and homelessness on the rise in our city. As I grew older, I came to understand that my family had struggled because people in a position of power hadn't fulfilled their obligations to protect us from being kicked out of our home. I discovered that my family had rights that could have kept us in our home, but we didn't exercise them because we didn't know about them. I decided to devote my life to helping families just like my own, becoming a tenant rights attorney and now a city council member, where I have made family and housing justice my top priority. I am indebted to organizations like the Center for Family Representation, the Parent Legislative Action Network, Bronx Defenders, and Neighborhood Defender Services for looking out for families and strengthening the fabric of our communities. As always, the work continues, but I am encouraged and empowered knowing how far we will go when we come together, like tonight, and renew our commitment to doing what is right. Now I'm going to hand it off to them. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you, Councilmember Abreu. So the Parent Legislative Action Network is a part of JMAC for Families, Just Making a Change for Families. Parent Legislative Action Network, otherwise known as PLAN, is a group of lawyers, social workers, impacted parents, and community members who care deeply about fighting against the family regulation system. It's a community that joins together to advocate for parents and for families across walks of life to ensure that our rights are, held, and to ensure that people understand what power we have in our communities when we're advocating against the family regulation system. And we'll share more resources about how to get involved with that later. But for now, we're going to start with some of the basics. What is the family policing system? Next slide, please. The family policing system, as the folks here leading this session believe, is a system that surveils, punishes, and controls families, Black and Brown and Native families disproportionately. So many of you may understand the system as the child welfare system. The reason we call it family policing is because we don't believe that it serves the needs of children or families at all. Instead, what we observe in our work and in our communities is that it is a system that separates, that destroys, that surveils, that controls families, specifically the families I mentioned, Black, Brown, and Native disproportionately. In 2021, Black children represented 20% of those entering care, that's foster care, but only 14% of the total child population, while American Indian and Alaska Native kids made up 2% of those entering care and 1% of the child population. So what we're seeing is an overrepresentation of these underrepresented communities in this system where their families are stuck. And it's very difficult to get out of that system once you're involved. Next slide. We also want to make sure to state that these disparities exist on a state and a city level. So it's not just nationally, but also right here in New York City and in our state at large. So Black and Latinx children comprise 61% of the New York City population, but constitute 87.8% of the children in protective investigations. In New York City, Black children account for 23% of the population, but 53% of children in the foster system. I just want to note that the last slide did use the word care, but similar to the family regulation system, we don't believe it provides care, so the preferred word is foster system. And even the Administration for Children's Services, or ACS, acknowledged in its own report that year after year, there are dramatic racial and ethnic disparities in the reports ACS receives from the state and is required to investigate, with Black or African American children and Latinx Hispanic children overrepresented in these reports. So the person on the slide to the left is Dorothy Roberts. She's a professor of law and sociology. She wrote a book about 20 years ago called Shattered Bonds, where she intended to write a book about Black women caught up in mass incarceration. And what happened when she sat down to interview these Black women is that they told her the system that impacts us the most is not just the system of mass incarceration and the prison industrial complex, but it's what one might call the child welfare system, what we call the family regulation system. And the more she spoke to these communities of color, what she found was that the family regulation system, in fact, parallels the prison industrial complex in the ways that it tears down Black and Brown communities. And what she wrote in that book is that if you came with no preconceptions about the purpose of the child welfare system, you would have to conclude that it is an institution designed to monitor, regulate, and punish poor families of color. So looking at the data that I've shared with you, looking at the lived experiences of those who have joined us today, those who are a part of PLAN, those that I work with every day, what we experience, what we observe is that this is not a system that provides help or support to families, but instead aligns with racism, with white supremacy, with homophobia, with all of the systems that we experience in our day-to-day to separate and destroy our communities. Now, there are many ways that we can look at this system and pick apart the ways that it impacts families using the law, but one of them is the ways in which poverty is equated with neglect. So I represent parents in family court who have been accused of abuse and neglect. the majority of petitions that come in are based in neglect. What we find actually, though, is not that the allegations of neglect are about parents that are leaving their children behind who aren't caring for their children. What we actually see is that we have parents who are in need. And so because they are in need, their children also have needs. Instead of addressing the needs of families, addressing the needs of communities, it gets labeled as neglect. So we see concerns about inadequate food, clothing, shelter, childcare, medical care, things that everyone needs and that any family could be provided with. But instead of being provided with these resources, they're brought to family court and they're told that they're bad parents. They're separated from their children. Their children experience trauma in the foster system where they're placed with different families, placed with different people who may or may not care for them as well as their families can. In fact, we believe that children deserve to be with their families. Children deserve to be with the people that care about them most, who have known them since the day that they were born. And the reason that we understand for poverty to impact families of color the most is that families of color are the most likely to experience poverty as well as people living in rural areas. And so we know that this equation of poverty and neglect is actually a targeting of the families that are experiencing poverty. We even see this in the ways that people are labeled as mandated reporters, people who are legally required to report places where they suspect abuse and neglect of children, and how families of color, people who experience poverty, are the most likely to interact with those who are labeled as mandated reporters. And so we're going to have more conversations about how families enter the system when we're talking about family Miranda rights and the rights that you have when ACS tries to enter into your life. But we wanted to make sure that you had a basis for how families are impacted by the system and how it's very specific families that get brought in. And that is the reason why we are fighting for these Black, brown, and low-income communities. I think with that, I'm going to pass it off to Shalonda, who's going to talk more about the Family Miranda Rights Act.
Good evening, everyone, and I'm glad to be here to talk about what the Family Miranda Rights Act is. So the Family Miranda bills were introduced by two city council members, Sandra Ong and Carlita Rivera. So the first bill, which is 0865-2022, requires child protective specialists to orally disseminate information to parents or caretakers about their rights during initial contact at the start of an ACS investigation. Currently has 15 city council sponsors. The next bill, which is 0294-2022, requires the Administration for Children's Services to provide a multilingual disclosure form to parents or guardians during a child protective investigation, and it currently has 12 sponsors. The reason why these two bills are separate and the reason why they are important, because as an impacted parent myself, who became part of that 87.8% of families and children who have been impacted by the system, we know that when we interact with any family regulation system caseworker, that our rights are not told to us orally, nor is it given right at the time of the investigation starts. We know that that information is often withheld and never received. You go to the next one. And so here you can see we held a rally in which both city council members, along with parents, along with impacted youth, came to really rally for the passing of these two bills. It is very important that families know their rights, and that on a first initial contact, when ACS makes the call or when ACS knocks on that door, before telling you that they have to see your children, or before telling you that if you don't let them in, they will call the cops, they should be telling you what your actual rights are and who you can contact in case you want legal advice. So what does the bill actually entail? So these are some proposed amendments to the actual bill, but what we want families and everyone in the city to actually understand is that these are not new rights. This is just making and ensuring that ACS orally tells parents what their actual rights are as they stand today. So at the initial point of contact with a parent or caretaker who is the subject of an investigation, ACS shall orally disseminate in plain language information regarding the rights during an investigation. Document what was said, and I highlight some of these things because they're very important, because if anyone has been investigated and if you have acquired your case notes, you often see that what was said to you is often omitted. So document what was said in the case record, that the information was provided, which shall include, but not limited to, the parent or caretaker is not required to permit the ACS representative to enter the residence of the parent or caretaker unless presented with a court order authorizing entry into the residence. Second, the parent or caretaker is not required to speak with the ACS representative. Any statement made by the parent, caretaker, or other family members may be used against the parent or caretaker in an administrative or court proceeding. This is very important to understand, because as much as we want to defend ourselves as parents and defend against ACS being weaponized against us or false statements, knowing that the statements that are being made will be and can be used against you is very important to understand. 3, the parent or caretaker is entitled to be informed of the allegation being investigated. Anyone with experience with ACS who's been investigated knows that oftentimes they don't tell us why they are knocking on our doors, only that they need to see our children. Majority of us have to pry and fight to understand why we are being investigated. 4, the parent or caretaker is entitled to seek the advice of an attorney and to have an attorney or a member of the attorney's legal team chosen by the attorney present when the parent or caretaker is questioned by an ACS representative. This is one of the most important factors, because as an impacted person, I was never told that I live in Brooklyn, that Brooklyn Defenders exist. I didn't know that a Neighborhood Defenders or CFR or a Bronx Defenders existed. If I would have, then I would have the autonomy to choose whether or not I wanted the legal representation or not. 5, the parent or caretaker is not required to allow an ACS representative to interview or examine a child unless presented with a court order to do so. We all hear the stories about how ACS takes children into rooms and examines their bodies, and we feel hopeless as parents that we can't tell them no. Under this bill, which this is already a parent's right, this will definitely let a parent know in writing and orally that they don't have to allow this to happen. Number 6, the parent or caretaker is not required to agree to any request made by an ACS representative to, including but not limited to, request to sign a release of information or to take a drug or alcohol test unless presented with a court order. We know a lot of cases don't even see the courthouse. We know a lot of these cases go directly into safety conferences, and nothing is required by the court to do so. And so this is how a lot of families get into services or other things that they were not required to do so by the court. So this orally being disseminated lets a parent know that they don't have to agree to something out of fear or coercion. Number 7, contact information for resources which may be available to parents and caretakers during a child protective investigation, including legal services from designated organizations and any phone numbers or hotlines available to parents and caretakers who are subject of a child protective investigation. This is also very important because we are trying to protect our children at the end of the day. We are trying to protect our families and our homes. And you want to make sure that you are proceeding with this investigation in the best interest of that family. And it's sometimes hard to understand the legal ins and out of family court, as they differ greatly from criminal court. So a lot of things that we think happen in criminal court are extended into family court, and it's really not like that. So being able to, at the beginning of an investigation, know why you're being investigated and be able to contact a legal defender organization right away will help your family make the best decisions possible. You can go to the next one. So this bill is essentially the same bill, but what it is that at the initial point of contact with a parent or caretaker who is the subject of an investigation, ACS shall provide the parent or caretaker a multilingual disclosure form in plain language available in the designated citywide languages and shall document in the case record that one has been provided. Such form shall be posted on the ACS website and shall include, so these are some of the similar same things. It's very important that information is provided in the home language of the person being investigated. We live in New York City. Not everyone speaks English, and not everyone is required to speak English. That is not an indication of whether you can parent or not. But what ends up happening is that English-speaking ACS workers go to homes in which there is a language barrier, and unfortunately, parents are subjected to these investigations without fully understanding in their language what they're being subjected to. So this is why it's very important to have both of these. One is not better than the other. We need both. We need the initial oral dissemination of information, and then we also need the written dissemination of information so that families can process what is happening and who they can call for support. And so again, this is also a photo from that rally in which parents like Tanisha Grant spoke up about how this system just ravages families and how it takes children away from the only family that they know and then thrust them into the system that doesn't take care of them. So again, I'm gonna go over a little bit of myths and facts. So again, the Family Miranda Rights Act does not create new rights. It simply ensures that families are aware of the rights they already have. So here's a lot of myths that a lot of people get confused about what the Miranda Rights Act would do. So a myth, the Family Miranda Rights Act will cause more harm and neglect. There is an emergency every time ACS knocks. These bills will stop ACS from doing their job. Parents already know their rights. We cannot trust communities to support families in crisis. These bills will make children less safe. And 7, ACS treats everyone with dignity and respect. And we know that's not true. So here's some facts. One fact is, the more we are informed, the better decisions we can make for our families. So here's some facts. These bills will not stop ACS from entering a home under exigent circumstances. So if there is a case in which there is substantial and credible evidence of harm happening, ACS still has the ability to, which they have the ability to now, to enter a home under exigent circumstances. 2, 96% of ACS investigations do not reveal a child safety concern. So there, over 96% of people are going through a case, and at the end of it, it's unfounded. So again, disproportionately, my family, along with other Black and brown families, poor families, indigenous families, are being subjected to these coercive and fearful investigations for at least 60 days, 90 days. And at the end of it, it's an unfounded case, which then leads us to pick up the pieces. How do we then go back into living our lives when they have been interrupted? 3, ACS will still continue to investigate, but they will not be able to violate a family's rights in the process. I always say this, somebody rights won't know that their rights are being violated if they don't know their rights. So if you know exactly what your rights are, who to contact to help you uphold them, it is less likely for an ACS worker to try to coerce and use fear tactics and police and everything else to get you to comply with what they need. Again, if you are in a system of care and help, you do not have to use those tactics in order to support people. Oral and written notification of rights are necessary to ensure that all families know their rights. I can't, reiterate that enough, that if you have the understanding and the knowledge of what your rights are, you are more equipped to support your family and seek support in time of need. 5, community organizations to exist to support families. There are community organizations right now that supply their own funding, fundraise, give out mutual aid, that are doing the work that ACS claims that they are doing now. If we were able to fund those programs more without the surveillance and without the coercion, without the fear, families could thrive. The system is making children less safe by surveilling, policing, and separating families. And 7, ACS workers themselves refer to the agency as a predatory system that specifically targets Black and Brown parents. And that is documented in New York Times. This is also from our state activation, where we went up to Albany to advocate for not only the Miranda bills on a state level, but for also the other bills that we have as informed consent and anonymous reporting, as well as preserving family bonds. So we will share information at the end of how to be involved in activations such as this. And so, yeah, we're looking forward to growing our coalition of more families who are no longer going to live in fear, but live in empowerment and sharing their stories. Now, I believe I'm going to pass it to Shane.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Shane Larkin, and I'm a social worker from the Center for Family Representation. Huge thanks to Shalonda and Zoe, my colleagues, for their portions. So basically, what I do at CFR is I help parents who are experiencing ACS investigations. And so the advice I'm about to share with you about your rights is, these are the conversations that I'm having with parents every day. So if we could go into the next slide, that would be great. Oopsie. I'm not sure what happened. Am I seeing the same thing as everyone else? Okay.
Yes, give us a second. We might have a short technical difficulty, but let me see if I can possibly pull up the slide.
Okay, great. And if it takes too long, I'm also happy to present my parts without slides, whatever's helpful.
Yeah, go ahead and continue as we figure this part out.
Okay, perfect, great. Okay, so I think that at some points during my portion of the presentation, I'm going to sound a little bit like a broken record. And I'm even going to repeat a lot of the things that Shalonda mentioned in their portion of the presentation. But one of the biggest things that I emphasize to parents when they're experiencing an investigation is that broadly, unless there is a court order, you don't have to do anything for ACS. You're not mandated by a family court judge to allow ACS into your home, to speak to ACS, or to give ACS access to your children. So that is the big thing to remember here. If there's no family court case, there are no orders. And so a lot of this is really up to parents to decide what information they may or may not want to share with ACS. And a lot of what I do with parents is kind of based on their goals, assess what kind of risks they might want to take. Because like Shalonda and like Zoe mentioned, we believe that the so-called child welfare system, the family policing system, is not helpful. And so when we give them more information, a lot of the time it leads to just additional surveillance, and additional basically recommendations for parents to do things that may not be meaningful or helpful. And I also want to uplift what Shalonda said about, investigations being in a way inherently traumatizing. I think, a lot of families go through investigations feeling like, the entire time they're just fearing the worst, that their family is going to be separated. And also children, in a way, there's a loss of innocence, having to also be afraid that they're going to be removed from their parents, being asked really disturbing questions. And so, a lot of what I do is I help parents avoid child removals or court involvement, but also I want to help parents assert their rights, which, like Shalonda said, already exist without the family Miranda law in place, so that they can, have their right to privacy and also just have greater control over this entire process and hopefully minimize the level of harm that's been caused to the family. So before we talk about what a parent's rights are, what does an ACS investigation typically look like? This is a list of things that ACS wants to do, but a lot of these things they can't do unless we give them permission because, right, there are no court orders. We don't have to give ACS any information, but there's a lot of information ACS has without us giving to them. So let's get into this. Home visits. This is the thing that, it's the knock at the door that many of us are familiar with. ACS, they want to come to your home. They want to assess the safety of the home. And so what are they going to do? They want to see if there are any potentially hazardous or unsafe objects within reach of children. They want to see the cleanliness of the home. Are there holes in the walls or appliances in need of repair? Which this goes back to poverty being equated to neglect, right? A lot of families that are experiencing surveillance by the family policing system live in NYCHA housing. And we know that NYCHA can be really unresponsive when it comes to making timely repairs or just maintaining the quality and the cleanliness of the space. ACS, they want to look into your cabinets to see if you have adequate food. They want to look in your fridges. They want to see, does everyone have their own sleeping arrangements? Are there adequate and appropriate sleeping arrangements? So when they enter your home, they're looking at everything through with a fine-tooth comb. They also want to make visits to the hospital. So basically, like, a lot of investigations don't begin in the home. For example, perhaps a parent has just given birth and the hospital searches for their name in their system and they see that there's been a ACS investigation in the past, and so they call ACS. So ACS sometimes wants to come to the hospital and interview a parent just after they've given birth, while they're under the influence of multiple, pain management medications. So this becomes a really sticky situation where the assistance of an advocate can really come in handy. ACS might also do something that's technically illegal, and it's called a social hold. So sometimes when ACS is worried that a child would be unsafe if they were released to their parents from the hospital, they will ask the hospital to basically keep the child, to not discharge them until ACS can conduct an investigation. ACS also wants to do school visits and interview children there. This is unfortunately something that parents don't have a ton of control over. It's one of those areas where ACS can do things kind of regardless of what the parent says. ACS will go and speak to school officials, and they will try to take a child out of their classrooms to do interviews. And a lot of the time it's the child and maybe the school social worker and the ACS worker alone in a room. ACS wants to conduct body checks. So this is the classic, it's really invasive. ACS asks the child to expose their arms, legs, stomach, and back, and they're trying to assess for marks and bruises. ACS wants to conduct interviews of all of the parents and children that reside in a home, and often they want to have those interviews separately because they believe children are more likely to say certain things without their parents present. They'll also want to conduct collateral interviews. They may knock on your neighbors' doors. They will speak to teachers and school staff, the way I mentioned before. Maybe they will speak to other people who allegedly witnessed an incident that led to a report. ACS will also conduct a criminal background check. And they'll look for domestic incident reports. So they'll run basically a report of how many times police have been called to a home due to a domestic incident. And if they find those, it's possible you're looking at a domestic violence allegation in your investigation. ACS also will ask parents to sign releases, like HIPAA releases, to follow up with children's pediatricians to make sure that basically the kids are getting physicals and all of their inoculations, but they also want to ask doctors, if they've ever had concerns about the family. They'll also refer their own note system. So Connections is basically the ACS database. So they can see if you've had prior investigations, even if they've been unfounded. And a lot of the time they will reference things from prior investigations that were in Connections. And again, this is not an exhaustive list, but the last item on this list is conferences and meetings with ACS. This is usually when ACS is considering filing in court against a family. They'll hold an initial child safety conference. And this is a really big place where you're entitled to have an advocate with you. Truly, you're entitled to an advocate at every step of the investigation, but definitely the initial child safety conference, because that's when ACS is basically trying to gather more information for their investigation before potentially filing in court. So those are some of the things that an ACS investigation entails. And again, some of these things we have control over, some of them we don't. So let's go into the next slide where we get into that. Okay, so truly, again, broadly, unless there is a court order, you have the right to decline everything from ACS. And specifically, these are rights that you do have. And again, it's not an exhaustive list. A lot of this was already referenced in Shalonda's portion. So you have the right not to speak to ACS case planners when they come to your door or answer their questions. You have the right not to allow them inside your home without a court order. Sometimes ACS may go to court and it's not a neglect case. They don't file an Article 10 neglect case, but they might ask a family court judge for a 1034 entry order. So that's basically ACS getting a court order to see your home or to see your children. It's kind of the ACS equivalent of a warrant or search warrant, but you don't have to allow them inside your home if they don't have one of those. It's your right not to discuss the allegations with ACS, especially if you've been arrested for similar, for like the same incident. Because like Shalonda and Zoe said, anything that you tell ACS can and will be held against you in criminal court and potentially in family court, if there is a family court case. You have the right to ask for an attorney or an advocate before speaking to ACS. This is one of the biggest things that parents don't realize, is that ACS, they come in right and they are treating this with incredible urgency. They think there's an emergency. They want to talk to you right now. They want to enter your home right now. Everything has to be done yesterday. But you have the right to tell them to slow down because this is your family. It's extremely important. You want to know exactly what your rights are before potentially, letting ACS inside. So you absolutely have the right to speak to someone before doing anything with ACS. You have the right to ask for time to think before answering questions and accepting referrals from ACS. Into the next slide, please. So you also have the right to be present when ACS is interviewing your child. Like I said before, ACS prefers to interview children alone. That's got to be terrifying for the children. And also, it's your right to be there and to intervene if we feel like ACS is asking something that's inappropriate, or if they're getting into topics that we know could be triggering to our child. You have the right to be there, even though ACS says, I need to talk to them alone. Too bad, it's my right to be there. You actually have the right to deny ACS access to your child. So if ACS comes to your home, they want to assess the safety of your child, it's up to you to present the child to ACS. You have the right to refuse referrals for services or assistance, right? The way ACS operates is they identify some safety concern that they have, and they want to put in place services that are very cookie cutter and often not very helpful. But that's what they see as solutions to these problems. You have the right to refuse those. Again, if you're not ordered to do services, you do not have to. You also have the right to ask for accommodations. I believe it was either Shalonda or Zoe that mentioned, you know, you don't have to speak English to be in this country and to be a great parent. But oftentimes ACS case planners will come to the door and they will speak to you in English. And if you speak Spanish exclusively, then that's not going to be helpful to you. And you're looking at a lot of your rights getting potentially violated. You have the right to ask for accommodations like an interpreter over the phone. Or you can say, ACS, come back with someone who speaks my language. Maybe you prefer someone in person to provide that to you. You also have the right to ask for basically, when I say accommodations, like maybe we don't want to tell ACS outright, no, you can't come into my house, but maybe you have a family member who's immunocompromised. The pandemic is still a reality, unfortunately. We can ask ACS, hey, we don't want you to come inside my house, but maybe I'll allow you to assess my home via video. So there are basically a lot of different things that you have the right to ask for, and ACS won't tell you that. And again, you also don't have to allow ACS to do body checks of your children. This is particularly true if the allegations have nothing to do with like corporal punishment or physical abuse. Again, it's something that ACS always wants to do, but they don't have to. They don't have to. And I say and more because really this is not an exhaustive list. Okay, we can go into the next slide here. How am I on time? Okay. Again, this is just me kind of repeating myself here. Unless there's a court order, it's your choice. At the same time, I do want to recognize here that ACS, like Shalonda says, just because a parent is exercising their rights, that does not mean the ACS investigation ends and ACS stops doing their job. ACS, unfortunately, doesn't just go away when we tell them to. And the investigation, that's 30 or 60 or 90 days, remains open, and ACS continually tries to make contact once every 2 weeks at least, regardless of what we tell them. And so ACS, they keep coming around. So sometimes a parent may decide, I don't want to share anything with them. You know, I have nothing to gain and everything to lose. I just want to keep them away. They can keep coming to my door. I know I can't make them stop, but I'm not going to open it for them ever. If a parent tells me that that's their plan, then that's what I'm going to help them do. However, sometimes parents think, okay, ACS, they've threatened me. They've said, if you don't do this, I'm going to remove your kids. Or if you don't do this, I'm going to take you to court. And maybe that's not a risk a parent is willing to take. That's okay too. In that case, maybe we find out a way to share certain pieces of information that don't compromise you very much. You know, I think there is kind of a impulse that a lot of us have. You know, we think honesty is the best policy. If I share a lot of information with ACS, maybe they'll trust me. When in actuality, really what we're trying to do is, if we're going to interact with ACS, what's the least amount of information ACS needs to leave your family alone? And so it's a really dynamic thing. And there's no right or wrong choices here. It depends on your family, your needs, it's your right. And so working with an advocate from either CFR, NDS, or Bronx Defender Services can help you decide what makes sense for you at any given moment. So we can go into the next slide. So say ACS is showing up. What can you do right then and there? Again, you have the right to say, ACS, I don't want to talk to you until I've spoken to an advocate. I'm going to call my lawyer. You can say that even though you don't have an attorney yet. It's fine to say. Call the legal provider in your borough, and we'll share that information. And ask for identification at the door. ACS is supposed to give you a notice of investigation, and that should have their contact information on it. And it confirms that there is an investigation, okay? Like this isn't a stranger claiming to be ACS. You should ask what the allegations are. Oftentimes ACS doesn't tell you what the allegations are because they also say this thing that they're trying to take a holistic approach. So even though they're in your home because there was a report that was made, ACS might want to ask you about every area of your life. And so they don't necessarily want to tell you what the allegations are, because then an empowered parent might say, I'm only going to talk to you about what your concerns are. I'm not going to talk to you about my mental health history or my substance abuse history or anything like that. Again, ask for documentation, ask for a business card, ask for the supervisor's information. Every ACS worker has a supervisor, they have a supervisor, they have a manager, there's a deputy, there's a chain of command that it's always possible to follow if you need to. And so it's great to have that information. And again, before you agree to anything, if you're not sure, you have the right to say, I need time to think about this, or I want to get legal advice before I do this. So those are some concrete things you could do if ACS comes into your life. Onto the next slide, please. So these are just some common questions that families have. And by this point, you would probably be able to answer a lot of these. Do I have to let ACS into my home? No, unless there's a court order. Do I have to answer ACS's questions? No, you don't. And if you want to maybe talk to ACS a little bit, you should keep it really focused on certain things. Like maybe you want to hear what ACS's concerns are, but you don't necessarily want to give them more information. You don't want to do their investigation for them. So again, hearing what those allegations are and saying, okay, maybe I'll consider services or something. Do you have to let ACS speak to your children alone? No. However, something that does unfortunately come up is if you have an ACS worker who's really gunning to speak to your child alone and they're not able to do it at your home, they may try to do it at the child's school. So again, this is one of those dynamic things where it comes down to a parent kind of weighing the pros and cons of each. Would I rather ACS speak to my child alone in my home or at school? Does it matter? These are some of the things that maybe you want to talk to an advocate about. Do you need to go to a drug test or have a mental health evaluation? Again, no order, not necessary. And in fact, these are two things that I feel almost never benefit a parent to do, especially if the allegations have nothing to do with drug use or mental health evaluations. Because once those things are in writing, say you test positive for any substance, including marijuana, even though that's legal now, ACS can and will hold that over your head. So it almost never benefits a family to do those things. You don't have to sign releases for ACS. Again, no order, you don't have to. And maybe you do want to, but you want to make it really limited. For example, I've helped parents sign HIPAA releases that expire in a week or even 3 days. And so we say, okay, ACS, you want to talk to my doctor so bad, you've got 3 days to do it. And you're not entitled to my entire medical record. You can only see, you know, my attendance or something, or anything really. So there's a lot of wiggle room. We don't have to do everything ACS's way. We don't have to do anything for ACS, or maybe we do some things, but we do it our way. And again, do I have to give them the information they're asking for? No, especially because they're going to ask you about everything, not just the allegations, not just the reported concerns. Okay. Into the next slide, please. Thanks, everyone. That's my portion.
That's me. I am back. So what are some next steps that you can take to educate yourselves on what your rights are? This website right here, Your Family's Your Rights, is a great resource. There is information more that you can print out about how to navigate investigations, what ACS could possibly be looking for, the process of an investigation. It also has information on each defender service in each borough. Unfortunately, Staten Island doesn't have an independent organization such as the CFR, Brooklyn Defenders, Neighborhood Defenders, or Bronx Defenders. And when families are in court, they actually get what's called an 18B, which is a court-appointed attorney. But that doesn't mean you can't use this resource and find advocates in other boroughs to help you navigate an investigation. This website also is in multiple languages, so you can always change the settings and get that information in the language that is most comfortable to you. here is the contact information for each defender service in the 4 boroughs. This information, again, is also available on Your Families, Your Rights. Each organization has in their family defense practice, has what's called early defense. So under the New York State law, you are not entitled to a lawyer unless you have like a court situation. But knowing that a lot of ACS cases often don't ever end up in court, there is a high need for families and parents, caregivers to receive legal advice during an investigative stage. Since ACS has what is called the CARES unit, and where a lot of cases are going through in which they try to say that it's not a regular ACS investigation, just work with us. Oftentimes, parent navigates those interactions alone without the support of a lawyer or a social worker. So in Harlem, a neighborhood defender specifically, if you were to say, I'm being investigated, I just got a call from ACS, we would direct you to our early defense team, in which they will be able to work with you on a plan to try and not have this move into an actual petition and have the investigation stop as soon as possible. What you also can do is join us at JMAC for Families and the PLAN, the Parent Legislative Action Network, to learn more and to be able to also help and support and going out into the community and sharing this information. We host webinars like this to bring this information to the community, but in PLAN Legislative Action Network, we also meet and we talk about what legislative pieces we need in order to affect the change that we want to see. So a lot of the work that you saw and a lot of the planning and a lot of the bills were actually influenced by impacted parents like myself. It wasn't just lawyers and lobbyists just coming up with what they think parents want. It's actually led by us and influenced by us, and we lead the charge on what needs to change within this system. Abolishment, of course, but as it stands right now, we are moving to have a lot of these things changed. We can move on to the next slide. So we're going to move into the question portion right now. We have 5 minutes. I just want to reiterate, this is a public webinar, and so we do not suggest you sharing any specific details about your experience or case to just protect your privacy. But if you have some pressing issues and you would like to contact someone, please go ahead and contact one of the Defender Service organizations. So I'm going to go directly into the questions. We have about 4 of them. So the first person asked, what is the pushback against the Miranda Rights Bill? Who has been the biggest player against passing them and why? The biggest opposition we have had is ACS itself. ACS has been playing this game with us around wording and not wanting to maybe have specific words for families in that. And so that has been the biggest pushback. And then there's just a pushback essentially of thinking that this system is working, right? We understand that we're not going to act as if harm doesn't happen. But we do know that when parents are supported, when families are supported, we can reduce harm, we can reduce certain things, but the thought process of thinking that ACS is the end all be all sole responsibility in preserving families and protecting children, we know that that's not true. So the pushback is really a mindset thing and of experiences where people feel that this system is actually working and not really seeing that what's not documented are the cases like mine, which are CARES that don't go into the percentages of parents and families in foster care or adoptees, right? We go under the radar because we just had an investigation that was unfounded. That data is not readily available, but we do see that in New York City alone, that's where that 96% of cases have been unfounded. And so that's where the real pushback is thinking that the system is working. ACS is a big institution and industry. And so they are pushing back against the language and against people actually understanding their rights. And then the second one, I'm actually going to pass over to one of our lawyers, but The question was, I'm curious how these rights would interact with those that exist for families in the criminal legal system. For instance, often ACS carries out a joint response with the NYPD to the home after an SCR report or physical or sexual abuse. A caregiver may decline to let CPS in, but a detective who has other invasive powers. What could be done in these situations? So I will pass that over to one of our lawyers to kind of discuss where that overlap and that intersectionality is.
I can jump in and then I'll ask Shane to just gut check with me. So having the police arrive at your doorstep can be very scary and is in fact a scare tactic to try and make you believe that you now have to let everyone enter your space, but they still need an order from the court or a warrant in order for you to have to let them in your home. However, now if you have police and ACS showing up at your door at the same time, you now have two different systems implicated in your life, both of which can be very dangerous and can get your family involved within multiple ensnaring systems that will take a long time to get out of. So you should immediately invoke your right to remain silent. You should immediately invoke your right to counsel. And you can assert your rights to the best of your ability in that moment, warranting the fact that there may be a bunch of police standing in front of you. Of course, you want yourself and your family to remain safe, but at the end of the day, if there is no warrant, if there is no order, those rights still exist and you don't have to let them in your home or any of the things that Shane mentioned earlier. And Shane, if I missed anything, please jump in. Great, I think that's everything. Pass it back to you, Shalonda.
Cool, so the next question is, what specifically do's and don'ts do we do and don't have control over? So I want everyone to understand that you do have a lot of control over what you put into an investigation, right? What you're sharing as a parent. You do have a right, as everything was listed here, but you also have a right to document everything. You have a right to record things that are happening in your home. You have a right to have a ring bell and pick up whatever is happening when they do knock on the door. You have a right to educate your children on how they should navigate talking to government agents, right? Because ACS workers are government agents, right? And so how you would navigate talking to a police officer when something has happened is how you would navigate this talking to an ACS worker. You have a right to seek counsel. And so when you make the choice to deny ACS entry, you also have the right to seek counsel and seek that counsel as quickly as possible, right? Because you don't want to navigate this alone. I would say in hindsight, one of the things that I really applaud myself for doing is that I wouldn't communicate with them via phone. Like I wouldn't talk because I knew that they're case notes. There are things that's going to be put in case notes. And so if an ACS worker chooses to lie about an interaction with myself and my family, I have documentation to say that that didn't occur the way that it was put into the case notes. Now, when it comes to children in schools, there is a state statute that does say that the school has to grant access, right? But that in that statute does not say that your child has to speak. And so again, you have the right to not say anything, and so does your children. I would suggest to folks to educate your children, just as much as we live in a time where Black and brown children are disproportionately adultified and targeted in these cases with the police. It's the same thing in ACS. So as much resources as you can gather, as plan, Family Your Rights, in the defender organizations, educate your children on these types of interactions. And then the last question that we did receive, oh no, we have two more. We're a little bit over, but so I'm gonna answer this one. Do you have to tell ACS caseworker what school your child attends? Again, you don't have to share any information that you don't want to. Let them do and conduct their investigation. And then the last one, why is there no effort to address dishonesty of workers? Many of us do not get grants to lobby such efforts and have tried for years to avail. I will say that there is an effort to do that, and within the plan legislation, we do work with other families, and us together, we work together to document our experiences and know that documentation is actually pushing forward some things that may be changing along with that. So I would say get together with another advocacy organization that is pushing to have these government agents be held accountable. Yeah, and that's what I can say for right now, is to get with others and be able to share your stories and document, and then know that things are coming. I promise you. So that is, we are at 7:04. And that is technically the end of our webinar. But again, we can put the slide back up. Can we go back to the slide that has the Defender organization's information? And you can reach out and actually email each organization if you are in that particular borough or in that area. And if you have any further questions, please reach out to us at all the organizations, as well as JMAC for Families, and we can all work together to abolish and change the system.
And Shalonda, quickly before we hang up, I just want to make sure that we give the council member a opportunity to add anything if he would like to add about what it is that he's going to do to support the work of this coalition and the parents on this call that are showing their frustration and concern about how ACS is behaving within our community. I think he might have dropped off.
I don't see him anymore, Joyce.
Okay.
But yes, I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. Please, again, the link for JMAC is in the chat. Please reach out to us. Please, 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 if you feel like you are navigating this system alone, know that you don't have to. Know that there are advocates, there are other parents, there are social workers, there are lawyers who are in this fight with you. Please don't let shame, coercion, and fear stop you from reaching out to us. There's a lot of us out here who are navigating this, or who have navigated this, and we can do this work together. So I want everyone to have a good night. There are some links in the chat, yourfamily'syourrights.org. And so everyone have a safe and peaceful evening. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Let's see. Let's see.
See, some people are still trickling out, but it seems like we probably are good to end. So thanks, Shane. Thank you, Anna. Good night, everybody.
Thank you so much.